Tonight is our adaptive reuse talk. We may rename it if you were listening to some of the discussion at the beginning of this talk. I think maybe we'll have a contest on a new title for what that means. And this is the last lecture of the semester. I am so delighted. We have two amazing speakers tonight, Ayón AIA and Françoise Astorg Bollack, both important experts. They're at the top of the field of architecture and preservation. It is such an honor for us to have them with us tonight. I'm going to introduce both speakers before they speak right now, rather than right before the second talk as well. Ayón AIA is both an architect and preservationist. Ayón's AIA, NCARB, NOMA, LEED AP has more than 25 years of experience working with historic buildings. Trained in his native Havana, Cuba, Washington, D.C., and New York City, his expertise ranges from building envelope evaluation and repair to full-scale rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of commercial and residential properties, as well as cultural and educational institutions. He currently serves as Vice President of Save Harlem Now, member of the Advisory Board of the Historic Districts Council, the Historic Preservation Committee of the Municipal Art Society of New York, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Preservation League of New York State, and that's where I met him. He is also an active member of Columbia University's Preservation Alumni. Ayón has his own practice, Ayón Studio, and is also an award-winning author with Jutta Potgieser, 2019 book, Reglazing Modernism, Intervention Strategies for 20th Century Icons. The title of Ayón's talk is Our Built Heritage is a Cultural Asset. Now, Françoise I've known for some time, and I'm just delighted that she would come and speak to all of you. So Françoise is an architect and principal of her own firm, Françoise Bollack, since 1981, a professor at Columbia University in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation since 1985, a preservationist, the author of another award-winning book, 2013 book, Old Buildings, New Forms, New Directions in Architectural Transformations. Françoise has worked as a designer for IMP & Partners, SOM, Mitchell Jurgala, and Ulrich Franzen. Her activities bridge the fields of education, criticism, and architectural practice. Her research focuses on the creative possibilities that rise from designing with existing and/or historic buildings. And the title of her talk is Old Buildings, New Forms. And these books will be placed in our special library for your use all year long. So with that, I hand it over to Ayón.
All right. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me, for asking me to come and talk to the students and to share the evening with my friend and colleague Françoise and with Carol, everybody. It's really fantastic. And what I'm going to do tonight is I decided that I would not talk about reglazing modernism, and I've been giving book talks about that quite often. And I thought that the invitation was so exciting and provocative about talking about adaptive reuse. And what I'm going to do is just use our work, some of our projects, to frame a conversation about this business of adaptive reuse. What is it, and how do we go about it? So allow me to just delve into it, and we can have a conversation about that a little bit later. So what is it, this adaptive reuse thing? And this is a universe. And in each of these introductory slides, I'm going to pose a question but the answer is really, really wide. So I'm not going to make any attempts to define it categorically. I just want to open the conversation. But suffice to say that I would define it as the need, the urge, the possibility to conceive interventions on existing buildings for new or expanded uses. And so there has to be an asset that has to be taken to the next level. So there's an understanding that is historic fabric, that is decay, obsolescence, and so on. So the second question then is what's required? How do you do it? And that is not a simple answer at all. My short answer to my own question was, well, it depends. It depends on the program, it depends on the building, it depends on what's happening, it depends on the conditions, the location, so many things. I don't think that anyone could sit on this desk and categorically say that this is what it is. So I encourage you to just think about that as a conversation that we're having, and do not take what I'm saying as the way to do it. But let's just then talk about a few of the ways in which we've done it in the firm, where we have to deal with protecting historic fabric, right? There is an existing building that is deemed to have some type of value. Sometimes it's cultural significance and so on. And in this particular case that I'm going to be talking about for the first case studies, these are buildings of significance where there is existing historic fabric that it's deemed relevant, and it needs to be preserved. And I'm going to share with you two case studies that we've been working on where we're dealing with temporary removal and salvage as a conservation measure, but also as a part of the process of adaptively reusing existing buildings. One of them, the first one, is the Archeo Keith in Flushing. This is a former theater designed by Thomas Lamb in 1928, one of the first atmospheric theaters in the 1920s, but went from vaudeville to movies and cinema and theater. Everything happened in this building. Really magnificent interiors, lots of historic finishes and decorative finishes, lots of plaster work, marble, terracotta, brass, wood, you name it, compo, you name it, it was there. This place was really the place to be, pretty fancy and pretty significant. Therefore, in the 1980s, it was actually designated entire theater as an interior landmark. The owner at the time fought the landmarks designation and managed to get the designation reduced only to the lobby and the vestibule. And this is what the lobby itself, which is composed of two main spaces. This space that I'm showing right now is called the grand foyer, and then the preceding space is called the ticket lobby. So these are more photographs, more recent, from the 1980s, perhaps, where it showed that up to then the building was still in some reasonable level of standing and conservation. Here's the ticket lobby with the ticket booth. Lots of ornamentation, lots of detail, lots of historic fabric that was deemed significant and also to be protected within this interior landmark designation. When we got there in 2014, things were not that well. The photograph on the right offer you an idea about the conditions at the time and how there was a lot of decay, and especially when we compare it to a set of photographs we got to get later that had been taken in the same building in the 1990s. And you can see that photograph on the right where, there used to be a little bit of damage that eventually became big hole, and lots of losses, lots of material losses, lots of decay, lots of issues in terms of integrity and conservation of the existing historic fabric. Here's the ticket booth on the right-hand side. Think of that photograph that I showed before. The ceilings, the plaster work, the awnings, things were literally falling apart. What was the project? So we were the project architects, the preservation architects for this intervention that consisted of demolishing the theater, except for the landmark lobby, to adaptively reuse the lobby as the lobby to a new residential building that was being designed by other architects. So we were working in a team where the other folks were dealing with the building and we were dealing with the lobby and making it work, not as a theater lobby anymore, but as a residential lobby, and that is some type of adaptive review. So if you can imagine the theater lobby, the original historic plan, this is the boundary of the ground foyer and the ticket lobby, and pretty much all of that was to be demolished, right, around the lobby, except the designated landmark and the second floor, the same. All the theater spaces were supposed to come down and be kind of engulfed into this new building. And here's a series of three-dimensional views that allows you to see the ticket lobby and the ground foyer, how everything is kind of growing or was planned to be growing around then. Lots of structural acrobatics, lots of coordinations between the new construction architect and the preservation architect to make sure that this historic material would be preserved. Pretty challenging, pretty challenging. How do you save a historic asset? How do you take it to the next level? How do you intervene if it's so fragile and if the conditions are like this? A lot of water, lots of water infiltration, lots of losses of original historic finishes, lots of decay. We actually had the unthinkable happen to us, which is that the building started to fall off in front of our own eyes. And we had a ceiling collapse at the ticket lobby when the plaster ceiling collapsed. We just got there one day and it had fallen overnight. And there was continuous collapse in the ground foyer. The plaster continued to literally fall apart. We did a very thorough documentation and assessment of all these pieces have been put together, and we had a sense that, you know, things were problematic. But the more we look into this, we understand the nature of the original historic plasterwork, the more it became a concern that it wasn't really well braced. There was also a lot of different substrates, not just three-coat plaster or metal lath, but also plaster on architectural terracotta, as I'm showing in this photograph and section here. Lots of plaster parapets that were like, you know, very robust from the front, but when you go to the back, just pretty much standing in steels. Not uncommon for this type of historic plaster work, but the main concern here was that if you can look at the scheme, all of these had already been cut out. Like if you see these hangers that have been cut out here at the bottom, that means that this was really pretty much hanging, and all that parapet can just swing out and collapse. Lots of risk of collapse. Very tall plaster parapets, very tall and skinny, 8 foot tall, unbraced, poorly braced plaster parapet. The condition of the ironwork was in fair condition, but there was a lot of corrosion that it was to expect from over the years. Different types of connections, bolts, wires. Some of the bolted connections were okay. Some of the wire connections were severely corroded, and there was a lot of concern about the integrity of all these connections when you would look at them from behind. A lot of the plaster itself was in fair condition, but there were concerns about, you know, how the cast ornaments had been installed on the free-coat plaster and the integration between the different systems. So a lot to think about. More importantly, we had hangers that were severely corroded. So this is a case where we're doing all these analysis and proposing to the commission that we have to do something unique. And while we're having those conversations, we had another collapse on the ticket lobby this evening, continued to collapse. Suffice to say, we managed to tell the commission to allow us to do temporary removal for off-site storage and restoration and reinstallation at a later date, so that we can just remove all the fragile historic fabric and allow for all that new construction above and beyond the historic space. So this is a graph that kind of summarizes what we were proposing to remove all that salmon color. It's the ornamental plaster work that was removed and salvaged, so on the lighter color, the orange color, and orange, at least in my screen, is material that was being restored, replicated. Same analysis on the ground foyer. Lots of things, a lot of the material was just removed and salvaged, and it was an extremely complicated operation where we had to literally plan for all of that, and all the plaster was taken out into pieces and out of the building and into storage. And here's kind of like the epic grand finale with all the stuff is already out, or most of it is already out, and there is very little left. And that space is no longer the space. The historic fabric has been saved and is in the process of being stored here for offsite storage. And then these are the beautiful renders that tell us about the future, the integration of all these pieces when they're going to come back together, and then they're going to be a seamless transition between the old theater lobby and the new residential spaces. And I know that we have lighting, sprinklers, and historic finishes, and so on, and on and on and on. There's another view, and here's a ticket lobby that will be restored in its original splendor. And here's a view from the ticket lobby looking out towards the street, where people are going to just now come in through precisely the sequence to get into through the ticket lobby into the ground foyer to get into the elevator to go into their very tiny apartments. Anyway, it's a very unique type of intervention, and not only we did it once, we actually did it twice. And the other case study is at the Times Square Theater. This is a tough theater. It's located on 42nd Street. You have the service access and the public access both on 42nd Street. It's an impossible theater to operate as such, just because you cannot block 42nd Street at your convenience and with that kind of pedestrian traffic. So it's really difficult to renovate it. There were several attempts to intervene in the building over the years, and none of them succeeded. However, the conservation plan that had been put in place in the 1980s had determined that there were a number of significant elements that must be restored and must be preserved. So the preservation plan was calling for specific interventions in some of those elements. The dome, it's really a suspended plaster ceiling, but let's just call it dome because that kind of makes it easier to understand what we're talking about. The proscenium arch, the sailboat, and the canopies. So when we got involved with this, they had this forest of pipe scaffold to create a platform to get up to those elements that were to be temporarily removed and salvaged. So here is the sailboat on the left-hand side. Here's the architectural conservator, my colleague, Jay Cardinal, looking at the dome itself and the perimeter ring that was the other significant element to be removed, to be salvaged. Here's another view of the sailboat, and look at the complex geometry of this plasterwork that goes one way, but then it goes also the other way. And then the decorative plasterwork and this in the dome, the canopies at the adjacent theater boxes, one of them with a major crack. And here's the project. What they wanted to do is to remove and salvage only the significant elements of this theater, the dome, the boxes, the proscenium, the sailboat, bolt, and remove and salvage these components for off-site storage, restoration, and reinstallation at a non-original location on the same building. So here's the view from the renders prepared by BBB for where those elements would be reinstalled at a non-original rooftop addition. So let's just call this preservation at La Times Square. I don't know if this would actually sell as preservation anywhere else in the world, but I think in this context, it was deemed appropriate. And a lot of what we had to do was just go through the whole really complicated process of coordinating all the process. This was more of a design build type of environment where we work very closely with the contractor to plan this whole operation, where to cut, and how to document every other single components and how to come in and out of the building and so on. And in essence, all these plastered elements, in this case, not because they were falling apart, but in this case, because they were extremely significant to be salvaged, were actually temporarily removed of storage. Here's the saucer dome at the top of the building, in the middle of the space that is just being sliced into pieces. On the right-hand side is kind of like the aftershock where the dome is gone. Some of the action progress photograph, I always like to mention Sanika from my office was really the one who was the project manager for that, who coordinated with everybody and worked with everybody, the contractors, the engineers, the conservators, everybody to really make this whole thing happen. Really a team effort, doing a lot of documentation, and things were sometimes coming down so that we could understand how to put the thing together. Plaster work is only relevant when it has ornaments. So whenever we have flat plaster, that was deemed to be non-significant and definitely could be demolished because that can also be replicated with sheetrock. So that gives you a sense of what we did with the sailboat, where a lot of the flat was demo, and only the significant cast ornaments were being removed and salvaged, and lower, very complicated, kind of theatrical, literally operation where things being broken into pieces and coming down and reinforced, and then eventually documented and cradled and taken offside. The proscenium arch being dismantled, you have to very carefully engineer that removal in the field and also before, so that we understand, how the pieces come together and how eventually will have to be reassembled elsewhere. There's also the same happening at the theater boxes. Plaster that was just flat was removed, but some of these fascias were also removed and salvaged for reinstallation. And here the guys kind of put it in already in one of the cradles. And those pieces are pretty large and heavy, so it just takes a lot of manpower and engineering and coordination to take them down and safely take them into the crates and out of the building and into a truck and eventually into a warehouse in Jersey, where they are now being stored. And we're getting ready for phase 2, which is about unpacking all of this and doing all the paint removal and all the restoration of these hundreds of pieces that eventually have to be reinforced and eventually going to be coming back into the building and reinstalled and in a fashion very similar to what they used to be. And this is kind of like the empty building where the historic fabric that had been significant has already been removed, and whatever is left in place, it's what's scheduled for removal and a severe alteration. I had 2 more minutes, and I want to talk about another project that when we talk about how else we address this issue of adaptive reuse, and another one is through additions. This is a really interesting case study that we work on. Very significant building in Charleston, North Carolina, a very prominent African-American place of historic significance, the Excelsior Club. In essence, one of the few places where for a very long time, Black folks were able to actually get together and come together. Speaking of architectural transformations, so we're thinking of this slide, Françoise, when you mentioned that term, the building itself had been purchased in 1944 by the founder, and it was really a 2-story house that he removed the hip roof and kind of transformed into this kind of art modern building by enclosing the porch, removing the hip roof and put it in a flat roof, adding these finials on the ends and so on. So here we have a 1952 art modern type of building that not only has a distinctive architectural character stylistically, but it also became a very prominent African-American place of significance, civil rights leaders, lots of people came there when they had to deal with the African-American, or when they were interested in talking to the African-American community in Charleston. So it's a really significant place. And as I said before, this is a place that is significant because of what happened there, which is like, this is where folks could actually get together and have a good time and be among themselves, right? And there was entertainment and so on. So the place, it's not necessarily about precious historic fabric. It's about the essence of the place, and character, what happened there. The building had been actually renovated in the 1980s, and what you can see is that they had actually removed the second floor and created sort of like a double height space there. So anyway, the intervention here for us that we were asked to work with was one in which we would take this building and turn it into a complex that would include a hotel and a museum as well. So here's some of the images that we created where we're kind of making this little building part of a bigger piece and creating a series of spaces and buildings around it that talk to it. and make it be part of the whole larger as ensemble of different uses, in this case, the hotel, the museum, the plaza, trying to bring people into the building. Not in this case because the building itself, it's significant or it needs to be preserved, but because actually the building becomes kind of like the main focus of the intervention, and doing so in a way that it could actually be developed into different phases where there could be post additional interventions and so on. And I just want to, I think if I have time, I could just go very quickly through one more intervention that we're trying to work on right now that we're working, which is a building in Long Island City. Not significant at all. This building is significant because of its industrial character, because it's there, because of its materiality, but not necessarily in terms of being distinctive architecturally. It's just an old industrial building by many that our client at the Chocolate Factory Theater actually purchased. And we've been working with them for a very long time to figure out how do we programmatically fit them into this one-story building. Do we add, do we go, what kind of relationship we have between the staff and the studios and the public? Do we excavate? Do we go down? Do we go up? Very long project. We're now pretty much working on it. And what we're trying to do here is just really trying to not retain existing historic fabric, but retain architectural character, the building character, which is really what's important here. So here's some of the photographs looking in one direction. And this is what that new lobby and entrance point will become coming into the new renovated venue. This is one of the existing spaces. And this is the same view looking down where there will be that kind of sequence of spaces between the lobby and the community room where people will be able to gather. This is what the community room may look like. And then it will be a large performance space that is kind of taking advantage of this magnificent industrial space with the big skylights and so on. So, and some of the office space that will try to really retain the character of the place. So these are just a few case studies and a few ideas about how to deal with this issue of adaptive reuse based on our experience at the office that I thought that would be interesting to share to frame our conversation.
Very much so. Thank you so much. So we're going to hand it over to Françoise.
Looks great.
We can't hear you.
Oh, you might be muted, Françoise.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Woohoo! Thank you very much. So we're going to pivot a little bit. These projects, Angel, were wonderful. But the camera is going to pull up a little bit and look at sort of a broader kind of context. And I'm going to talk about a book I published, which is called Old Buildings, New Forms, New Directions in Architectural Transformations. We're having an interesting discussion with Carol before starting this talk, because I'm not a fan of the expression adaptive reuse. Because buildings grow sometimes in the same use. They need to be changed, to be refreshed. Sometimes they need to expand, but it's not necessarily a reuse or an adaptation for different use. And to me, the word adaptive reuse seems to be so unambitious. And so what I want to talk about with this title, Old Buildings, New Forms, is the formal possibilities that arise out of working, adding to old buildings, transforming them, sort of tinkering with them. And these are not only programmatic possibilities of renewal, but they're also formal possibilities of discovery of new formal expressions. And, it just changed. And I want to remind all of us that a lot of buildings, which are iconic buildings in the history of architecture, are in fact additions. They're in fact transformations of an earlier building. And here we have the Palazzo della Ragione in Vicenza, in northern Italy, by Andrea Palladio in 1546. And what you're looking at is a modern, because Palladio uses the word modern in his writing, is a modern addition to a late Gothic building. And it's modern because it's regular, it's white, it's ideal. It has a sort of rational aspect to it. And it is added to, as you see in this picture on the left side of the insert picture, to a late Gothic building, which is much darker, which has a completely different expression. So this is what the city of Vicenza wanted to do. And it did this for essentially formal reasons. It did this because it wanted to remain in the game. It wanted to remain an important city in the area of Venice. And what it did was to modernize its buildings. And a lot of times when we change buildings, it's for exactly this reason. So I want to talk about, so with this kind of introduction, I want to talk about why one should be interested in working with old buildings. And basically, my position is that it allows you to have it both ways. It allows you to have, on the left of the picture is the Palais Royal in Paris in the 18th century. It allows you to have the weight and the comfort and the tradition of a building form that you know, in which you know how to act, that relates to other buildings that you know. But it also allows you to have the picture on the right, which is what we can do now, which is it's very open, it's very unhierarchic, it's very loose, it has a sort of optimistic quality to it. It's sometimes experimental, and this is the Kaufmann House in Palm Springs by Richard Neutra in 1946. And I'm sure you all know the other Kaufmann House, although I can't question you, it is really Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, for whom actually Richard Neutra worked in his early career. So it's a very sort of very neat story. So the idea is that you don't have to throw away one to have the other, either way. And a lot of architectural education has taught us mistakenly that to turn our back on the old architecture, that it was passé, that it was, you know, headed for dumpster of history, and that we had to commit ourselves completely to this picture on the right. But in fact, we can have both. And this is what I'm interested in, and this is what I'm going to show you. So I studied this field, and in order to study this production, you know, we're looking at late 19th century, early 21st century. And this, I think one has to sort of put things in categories. I'm looking at different types of design interventions into an old building. There are 5 of them. One of them is insertions. The other one is parasites. The other one is wraps, juxtapositions, and weavings. Now, I'm going to give you one example for each one of them. This is a sort of a quick flyover. Insertion, this is a diagram. Insertion is the old building is the black line. Insertion is you put something into the old building. And so the whole game becomes, what is the relationship of this new thing to the old thing? You know, does it poke out of the window sometimes? What is the relationship of this new insertion with the old wrapping around it? So the whole question is the relationship of these two objects. And I'm going to show you a wonderful little project in Germany. And I love this project because it's very, very, very small. And so I want you all to think, as your students, and you're going to embark on a career, that you can be very ambitious with a small project. This is, you can see this man who's standing on the wall. And so you see this is a very, very small old building, which was a pigsty. This is a place where the pigs lived and where they fed in this little window, which is on the lower right side of the picture where the feeding trough was. And this is in the Black Forest, and you cannot demolish anything in Black Forest in Germany. You cannot take out any trees. So this architect had the idea that he wanted to save this building, and he would save the building by putting into it a whole new liner that would match its design. You see this window is like this window. And that would actually make the inside of the building usable without him having to affect the old building. So the new liner becomes, in a way, the protector of the new building, because a new roof has been built on the new liner. And you have this new combined work, which is very exciting because you have this old ruin, And then you have this new, very finely crafted, woodwork thing inside. You see this picture on the right, which the new lino is made in 2 pieces so that they could manage the dimensional differences. And it was fitted down into the building with the middle piece sort of connecting them, and then the new roof is put over it. So this is the before condition. So this new thing gives life to this building, a life that it wouldn't have otherwise, because it would fall into ruins. And the architect talks about how the ruin will have a life on its own, and maybe at some point, the ruin will fall into real ruins and the new building will become the liner. So it's a very poetic, interesting, intellectual thing. And so again, this is a small project, but it's very ambitious in terms of its ideas. So you have this, change of texture between this very, very kind of texture thing and a very manufactured woodworking thing, and then the sharp edges of the new roof and the rough edges of the line of the thing. Then the second category is parasites. Parasites is when you have a new thing sort of putting itself on top of the old thing and kind of getting its life from the old thing. So the new thing could not exist without the old thing. So here again, the game is the relationship between this new thing, its contour, how it penetrates or doesn't penetrate the old thing, what these relationships are. And I'm showing you a building in Toronto, Canada by Alsop Architects, which is very provocative, and like all buildings, I'm sure you have seen it. And I expected not to like it because I thought I don't like this kind of brutal architecture. But actually, when I was there, it turns out that I was really fascinated by it because it's a very, very, very intelligent project. This is the building before. And there's a little housing project here, which is here. And people here want to be able to go shopping in this neighborhood, and people in this neighborhood like to go here. This had been cleared out as part of urban renewal. And so the architect conceived of putting the building above ground so that people could still cut through this open garden. So in terms of preservation, he leaves the building pretty much untouched and then halves this building way above. This, which was a courtyard, becomes the new central core of the new building with new elevators. And there's a new sort of fancy kind of free-form entrance with a handicap ramp here. And this is what it looks like. And the reason I think it's successful is because there's a sort of a playful quality to this project, which sort of removes the brutality out of it. So you have these crayon colors here, and which are the supports for this huge rich structure which is above, whose brutality and seriousness is really denied by the fact that you have this really overall pattern of little pixel things. So I think it works pretty well. And again, I'm trying to get you interested in the fact that this is a new form. In other words, this is not something you could build out of anew, because you wouldn't have come up with this idea. So the provocation of having to work with an existing building gets you, the architect, and you, the designer, to come up with ideas that you would never have been able to think about otherwise. This is also a parasite. This is a project of mine in Chesterwood in Massachusetts, which is a new piece to a historical set of barns. This is a new visitor center. I mean, there's a logic to it. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but each one of the barns this was one period, this is another period, and each one had been done in different materials with the logic of the time at which they were done. And so we thought that, well, if a farmer had to add to this building, he or she would probably use a metal prefabricated building. So that's what we tried to evoke. And we connected this roof at the eave, at the top of this roof for it to drain properly. And then inside, we left the structure of this continues inside. And then we left this structure existing. So there's a sort of staccato rhythm. There's a relationship between the new curved trusses and the old, very thin, carpentry work. And so the relationship with the two, there's a remainder of the old and there's a presence of the new. And these relationships, as on the outside, enhance the new, enhance the old. And that's kind of the idea. The other category is what I call wraps, which is a case where the new thing sort of wraps itself around the old thing. And I'm going to show you a project in New Jersey, which is a project I also expected not to like when I went to see it, by an architect called Ayón AIA, where he wrapped this whole sort of, off-the-shelf industrial structure over what you can see in this picture is a very fragile little gardener's cottage, which was a historic cottage. Very, very rich project. So this gardener's cottage is a historical cottage. I don't want to spend too much time on talking about it, but it is a historical cottage that he had bought this property. This cottage was not really designated, but he had an emotional connection to this cottage because he had worked on it when he was in high school. So he wanted to keep it, but it was fragile. And so he decided to enclose it in this hangar, this sort of airplane hangar, which is metal siding and very cheap, off the shelf kind of thing. And so this is the facade of this facade. He cut off an addition he didn't like, left the trace of it on the facade. And so this is enclosed in this space. And then he built a whole new kind of what he calls his old office building at the end of the space, which is concrete block. This is a view from the outside with the addition removed and the chimney left to create an outside space. So during the summer and the good weather, he has these huge doors that open that turn the inside space as an outside space. And again, this is a case where I had to revise my prejudices because I usually don't like buildings to be in buildings that should be outside to be inside. But in this case, it works in my view because the space in which it is so large. And it is so this is the old little building with this porch. And the space is very rich. It's kind of very urban in the sense that it has a lot of things happening. So this is this nine room little office building, as he says. And then the new building is not coming up close to the old building. So there's a lot of interstitial spaces, which are very interesting. And then, for those of you interested in interior design, inside the old building, as you see on the picture on the left, he has decorated this in the most precious. It's not at all industrial. It is like red lacquer, extremely expensive fabrics. It's extremely delicate. It's extremely detailed. So this whole world is extremely intellectual in many ways and really, really interesting. Then we have juxtapositions, and then we have another project, which is the case where the new building stands aside from the old building in what an architect described to me as studied indifference. So it's all about the relationship between these two things and how they keep from talking to each other while being very aware of each other. And this is a project in northern Italy, in Nembro. It's a new library, and the new library. So this is actually a real adaptive reuse, architectural transformation, but it was a change of use. This was a little hospital and became a library. So this is the addition, and there's a space between the two, they don't touch. And the architects sort of adopted my cardinal principle when adding to a building, which is that you have to use the original entrance of the building, because otherwise you minimize the old building and it just dies on the roof. So they use this, you go down to the new building by going down this stair to downstairs, and then you reemerge it here, reemerge it through the stairs and elevator here. So this is a new building, which is a library. And it's this kind of treasure chest of books. The books are on the spine and the desks are on the outside. So you go down and this is a children sort of reading room and you emerge into this. And they played this game of contrast between the very smooth, you know, plastered surface of the original building and this very textured terracotta curtain wall. And these are books. These are book-sized things, and they're mounted on vertical poles, and they turn around. And so it's very rich symbolically as well. This is a courtyard in the old building. You can look at the new building, and if you sit in the new building at the desk to read a book, you can look back at the courtyard, and you look through these books. And so the two buildings are very different, and they enhance each other in many ways. And it's a new form, it's a new combined form. And it's not something you could do anew. This is something for which you need an old building to do. And it has all this layering, which is really interesting. And my last category is weavings. And weavings is a very difficult category to handle because you can have a coarse weaving like a quilt or a coarse carpet or a mended piece of cloth that you haven't mended very carefully. Or you can have very, 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 very tight weaving like these wonderful ponchos from Peru or, you know, so you can weave at a lot of different scales. But weaving is when the old building and the new building are woven together. And it's very hard to pull them apart. If you think of the category before, you know the new piece and you know the old piece, and they're distinct. In the weavings category, it's hard to tell them apart. So the building I wanted to show you because you can actually go see it is Mas Mocha in North Adams, Massachusetts, by an architectural firm called Bruno Cott. Done in 1986, 1999. This is a project that was started by the Guggenheim Museum. It became its own project. And it's a project that took over a very large industrial site of an electrical manufacturing concern. And they've been renovating and sort of working on a lot of those buildings. So the buildings are still very readable as old buildings. There are some overlays, like the graphic overlays, which you can see here or here. There's some overlays, like some new elements, like this is a new entrance to the restaurant. It's all a sort of, you know, Carol was using the word collage. It's all kind of an over pasting and removing and pasting and so it's all very interesting in how you approach each corner. There's no really overall formal definition to this, except that the old buildings have been handled. So these are a few of the interior spaces. On the right, the architects remove a floor to create a two-story space, inserted some lobby columns here to support a new structure at the top, introduce a new sort of garage door so that you can go in and out, you can move in large art. But did that in the most direct sort of way. You see the support for the door here. But then left the painting, you know, untouched. So this is painting that's kind of falling apart. This is a green painting, so you can still read the two floors. So this becomes its own thing. The fact that a space, when I was working for AIA, you know, eons ago, the word was consistency. Here, the word consistency is absolutely irrelevant. Here it's more about the layerings of interventions, the layerings of people's lives in the building, and the fact that you provide an image for this and for people to realize that something's happened in the building. And this is another stage of this building, and that you should sort of reflect on that. This is on the upper left is another space, which is also a large space, where the ceiling, the structure of the roof is visible. This is a space in the middle where they added some sort of cheap sheetrock here so that you could get an exit. And so it's all done in a very direct way, in which the architect is trying to extract is trying to make the history be the design. In other words, the scars become the design, the history becomes the design, the textures become the design, the mistakes become the design. And here they had to, on the lower left, they had to introduce a fire alarm box, and they just routed it through the brick and then sort of cemented it over. So the idea of this overlaying scars becomes a design, and it doesn't have a form, you know, that you can track through history, but it's more about how you make a building legible in a way. So I think this is it for me. And I will leave us on this last image, which is, of course, a weaving as well, and is the Altes Museum in Berlin, which was worked on by David Chipperfield. It had been bombed at the end of the Second World War. And here again, you know, the scars are left. These are like, this used to be covered with plaster, and it had this enormous historical, heroic mural, but they haven't recreated it. They've just left the substrate, and then they've introduced new elements and a new floor. So it's all about this layering and how you can make the layering be the design. So with this, I will leave you to ask questions.